Hello, welcome to Skipton Baptist. I'm Martyn, but I wonder, do you know who these 6 guys are? Ross, Rachel, Monica, Chandler, Phoebe and Joey. They are, of course, the characters from Friends, the American TV sitcom. A show about 6 people who live in Manhattan, New York, and it follows their lives, the ups and downs, the changing nature of their friendships. It's one of the most watched TV shows of all time. It's still one of the highest rated shows on the various streaming channels, despite the final episode being broadcast over 20 years ago now. And although it was only ever a TV show, the cultural effect of Friends has actually been quite long lasting, and academics have studied its influence and have tried to deduce what was it that made the show so popular. Why does it seem so relatable? Why does a show about 6 people, 2 apartments and 1 coffee shop have so much resonance with lives of people all over the world? I read one of the academic papers on this, and the researchers found that the show resonates because, unsurprisingly, we all have a deep desire and need for friends with whom we can survive the ups and downs of daily life. See, the promise of the show, Friends, is that despite failure, despite problems, all you need are good friends. That poorly paid jobs, dysfunctional relationships, the realisation of just how little control we have of our lives, all of these things can be ameliorated, can be made better by the perfect group of friends. But is this actually true? Do we have a controlling Monica, a wisecracking Chandler and a ditzy Phoebe in our lives? Is this what friendship is about, or is in fact there a better example? Well, this week we're continuing to look at David's life, and following on from Phil's sermon last week about how to have enemies, this morning we're examining how to have friends through the lens of David's friendship with Jonathan. Now, I don't know if you've ever thought about this, but friendship is actually a really weird thing. It's quite strange. Consider your life today. Pretty much all your other relationships have some form of legal basis. You're employed, you have a contract. You're a citizen, you have rights and obligations, you're under the law of that country. You are married, you've made vows, you've signed a register, you have a legal document to prove it. If you have children, then you've legally registered them, or at least I hope you have. And you have a responsibility in law for them until they are at the age of their majority. In nearly all our relationships, there is a form of legal obligation or rights and duties. And if these are broken, then there are legal procedures in place to deal with the breach. These relationships are seen as so fundamental to the fabric of our society that they are given special protection. In contrast, friendships are completely voluntary in nature. They're characterised by a distinct absence of contractual arrangements. Friendship has no status beyond that which you and your friend give it. It's entirely up to you what your friendship looks like. It is a voluntary act. But are friendships actually useful? See, as a society, we require a proportion of the population to get married, to procreate, to ensure the continuance of the species. We need some people to grow crops, to make sure we've got something to eat and so we can live. We need some people to become skilled in health and medicine so we can survive illness and disease. We need others to create buildings, establish law, to educate. I could go on and on. But does society have a survival need for friendship? C.S. Lewis, in his book The Four Loves, says this: "I have no duty to be anyone's friend, and no man in the world has a duty to be mine. Friendship is unnecessary, like philosophy and art. It has no survival value, Rather, it is one of those things which gives value to survival. As I said, friendship's a bit weird. We don't need it to survive, but we won't survive well without it. In his research, Professor Robin Dunbar explains that friendship is the single most important thing affecting our psychological health and well-being, as well as our physical health and well-being. Well, David and Jonathan had one of, if not the most extraordinary friendships ever recorded. What made it so great? There were two specific things that made this such an extraordinary friendship. Firstly, although they were complete opposites, they had the strongest of bonds. I have two daughters, and when our youngest went off to university, we heard a lot of complaints about one of the girls in her flats. You see, our daughter and this girl were as different could be. Our youngest daughter is happiest when competing at swimming or out in the countryside, normally covered in mud. She absolutely hates cities and going out. Her flatmate was more at home in a club or out all night partying, her days spent in bed recovering or on the sofa binge watching Netflix, and under no circumstances would she venture out into nature. However, over time, these two have become the most unlikely of friends, although they are still chalk and cheese. Our daughter has ventured to the odd night out at the Students' Union, and her flatmate has done some walks out in the countryside, and 2 years on, they still meet up, they still message, and they're still friends. Sometimes the most different people will bond over a shared thing. For our daughter and her friend, they both had a bit of a rocky start at university, and that one thing was enough of a bond to start a friendship. See, Jonathan and David were opposites. Jonathan was a prince, David was a shepherd. Jonathan had his own armour, David had a harp and a slingshot. Jonathan grew up in a palace and was trained in kingy stuff. David grew up in little town of Bethlehem and was trained in sheep. Jonathan was of the tribe of Benjamin, David the tribe of Judah. Jonathan was the oldest son in line to inherit the throne. David was the youngest of 8 boys, but anointed the next king. See, despite all these differences, they were the best of friends. I mean, to be fair, why wouldn't you want to be friends with David? He is a giant slayer, he's a fearless warrior, but he's also the sensitive musician, the crooner, singer-songwriter at night. See, David was a hero. He defeated Goliath, he whooped the Philistines, and he soothed the troubled king and made the ladies swoon. This guy had it all. Why wouldn't Jonathan want to be friends with him? Cool by association. How's about because this shepherd boy was going to take your throne? The position you had been raised to take. Most people in Jonathan's shoes would have felt jealous, bitter, threatened. But Jonathan saw what God saw in David. Don't know if you remember back to week 1 of this series, and Catherine explained that God doesn't look at the outward appearance, but rather at our innermost being, our heart, our mind and soul. David was a man after God's own heart, and is remembered as such. But Jonathan was clearly a man after God's own heart too, and evidently had a depth of spiritual discernment and insight that he should be well remembered for. David and Jonathan were from very different backgrounds, but they had a shared bond. Yes, they were warriors, but that wasn't it. Yes, they both had a claim to the throne, but no, that wasn't it either. Rather, their bond was that they were both men after God's own heart. They were men of faith who served the living God. They may have been very different men, but they had the strongest bond you can possibly have. And what was the second reason they had such a great friendship? They had a covenant friendship. Ah, yes, you say. What's a covenant friendship? 1 Samuel 18, 3 and 4 tells us, "And Jonathan made a covenant with David because he loved him as himself. Jonathan took off the robe he was wearing and gave it to David, along with his tunic and even his sword, his bow and his belt." See, the term covenant is of the Latin origin, convenire, meaning a coming together. In the Old Testament, it's the word berit. It's used 285 times and it denotes an alliance or a pledge between two parties. Interestingly, they're always two equal parties. From everybody else's point of view, David and Jonathan were not equal. Jonathan was heir to the throne and had power. David was a shepherd boy and he did not. Yet Jonathan honoured David by making him his equal in their friendship. Their covenant, their oath to each other, their promise to each other was that no matter what happened, David and Jonathan would remain friends. Their relationship was a loyal, deep promise before God to look out for each other, to stand up for each other, to love each other, and to protect each other's families. And what's more, we know that they did. Jonathan ended up protecting David and saving his life twice in chapters 19 and 20 of 1 Samuel. Jonathan goes as far as aligning himself completely with David in 1 Samuel 20, asking God to call David's enemies to account. The enemies in that covenant include Saul, Jonathan's own father. And when it became clear that David would inherit the throne instead of Jonathan, we read this in 1 Samuel 23:17. "You shall be king over Israel, and I will be second to you." Jonathan held fast to his covenant with David to the end. As we know, Jonathan died tragically in battle. As we heard from Phil last week, David wrote him and Saul a lament out of sorrow. And although David could now do no more for Jonathan, he remembered his covenant, and David cared for Jonathan's son Mephibosheth, who lived in the palace and ate at David's table like one of David's own sons. The covenant between David and Jonathan held fast even after death. Now, we might not have friends who are so completely opposite to us, and most likely we don't have friends we've made such an incredible covenant with. So, what can we then learn from David and Jonathan's friendship? What are some of the attributes of a great friendship? Because if we know these, not only can we have good friends, but more importantly, we can be a good friend. Well, in good sermon style, I've got 3 points. And the first one's this: a true friend is true. Oprah Winfrey said this: "Lots of people want to ride with you in the limo, but what you want is someone who will take the bus with you when the limo breaks down." I guess we've all known friends who are there for the good times, but when the hard times hit, suddenly don't seem to be around quite so much. Whereas a true friend always loves you. As Proverbs 17:17 says, "A friend loves at all times, and a brother is born for adversity." In other words, it's the friends who you can pick up and call at 4 a.m. that matter. We see this in Jonathan. He wasn't a fair weather friend. He didn't maintain his friendship with David for only when there were good times, when they had some laughs, or simply because it might have some perks down the road when David became king. A true friend does not change when the circumstances of life change. We are to be a friend both in the good times and the bad, sharing the joys of life as well as the sorrows. Jonathan had reasons to give up on his friendship with David. Their friendship was not without some stress. In fact, Jonathan's very life was threatened because of his loyalty to David. We read in 1 Samuel 20, "Why should he be put to death? What has he done?" Jonathan asked his father. But Saul hurled his spear at him to kill him. His own father tried to kill him, And yet Jonathan remained faithful to David. And in the end, David remained faithful to the descendants of Jonathan, caring for them as if they were his own family. A true friend is true. A true friend is faithful. If we are to be true friends, we need to be prepared to stay with our friend through thick and thin, whether they're successful or unsuccessful, irrespective of whether they've offended us or not. True friendship establishes faithfulness. When you've made a fool of yourself and a complete mess of things, your closest friend is the one who will say, "Don't give up, I'm here for you." Second, a true friend loves you as they love themselves. 3 times in 1 Samuel we read that Jonathan loved David as he loved himself. What does this mean, to love someone as you love yourself? Now, I don't know what you feel about you, but I quite like me most of the time. I generally don't go out of my way to hurt me or upset me. I try not to be unkind to me. I look after me. I feed me. I rest me when I'm tired. I make sure me is great. I'm actually quite attached to me, and I very much try to keep me alive and kicking. If you are to love someone as you love yourself, then you are to value someone's life as you value yours. To love them as you love you. Unfortunately, the love part of this is often taken out of context, and today there's a failure to understand that good friendship can exist that is not sexually based. This goes very much against the current worldview. TV shows, books, films, theatre all portray friendship with an underlying sexual tone. See, in our Western culture we get a bit weirded out about some of this stuff. Look at these verses from 1 Samuel. After the boy had gone, David got up from the south side of the stone and bowed down before Jonathan 3 times with his face to the ground. Then they kissed each other and wept together, but David wept the most. And from 2 Samuel, I grieve for you, Jonathan, my brother. You were very dear for me. Your love was wonderful, more wonderful than that of women. That was from David's lament. Do you feel a bit uncomfortable with some of that? A bit not sure? Does it sound not quite right? But don't forget, we are reading a biblical account, held up as an example of one of the greatest godly friendships between 2 fully grown men. We must not be led to think it's embarrassing for men to have such a close relationship. In fact, for anybody to have such a close relationship. We might be tempted to think this is embarrassing or uncomfortable, but this is because we live in a world that is hypersexualized and champions a sort of rugged individualism, particularly for men. And I'm going to speak mostly to men here because a few of us are a little bit hopeless at this stuff. For the world, being a man is about being some rugged, macho, independent. But the biblical model is quite different. Our greatest intimacy comes from our deepest vulnerability. But that's not easy. My closest male friend is someone who I'm not afraid to be vulnerable with, and he returns the compliment. We have both shed tears together. We have talked about the stuff that hurts and that which we hold dearly. We know each other's pains and losses. We know each other's hopes and dreams, and at times we've even admonished each other and spoken truth to each other, even when it's a little bit painful. Sharing things with another person that nobody else knows. Sharing sorrows and suffering, sharing dreams and disappointments, sharing our greatest joys and our worst failures. That is the kind of relationship that comes from and needs deep, deep intimacy. And that kind of friendship is in short supply today. But it requires us to love as we love ourselves. My third point is this: a true friend encourages spirituality. Good friends provide spiritual encouragement and spiritual strength. This is the very heart of what godly friends do, as Jonathan does here in 1 Samuel 23:16. And Saul's son Jonathan went to David at Horesh and helped him to find strength in God. This means friendship is more than merely hanging out together. It's more than sharing the same interests or hobbies. Instead, godly friends seek to build one another up. They try to help one another grow and mature spiritually. Godly friends strengthen each other in God. Now, this does raise the slightly tricky question of who our closest friends should be. Should we have close friends, those who are not Christians? It's a difficult topic. There are many opinions, and Paul writes this in 2 Corinthians 6:14 and 15. Do not be yoked together with unbelievers, for what do righteousness and wickedness have in common? Or what fellowship can light have with darkness? What harmony is there between Christ and Belial? Or what does a believer have in common with an unbeliever? Would Paul's instruction here include close personal friends? It quite clearly includes marriage, but what about our friends? Now, not everybody here will agree with me. Forgive me if you don't, but I can give you only my thoughts. And I have no doubt that I am called to be salt and light to the world. I don't do that by ignoring people or shouting, "Begone, sinner," every time the milk gets delivered, or lying in wait with the Bible ready to get the Amazon delivery driver when they call. That doesn't work for me. I can't demonstrate the love of Jesus that way. Whereas I can ask the postie how her bad leg is this week, or chat to the fishman about how his family is, how he's getting on, or listen to my barber and give her counsel when she has a problem. Then I'm being salt and light in this world. However, if I want to be as close as David and Jonathan, then I can't do that with someone who doesn't understand the biggest part of my life. Someone whose soul doesn't commune with Jesus. It really can't commune with mine. We are defined by our faith, and so we can't have the deepest friendships with someone who has no faith. For me, the equation doesn't balance. It just doesn't work. An unbeliever is not capable of strengthening you in God. Rather than pointing you towards God, an unbeliever will only ever draw you away from God. So my plea would be that we continue to form friendships with those who have no faith, that we pray for those friends, that we love those friends, we serve those friends, but that we make our closest friends, those whom we covenant with, we make these from our believing friends. Now, before we finish, I want to consider one more thing. Back at the start of this talk, I said this: we all have a deep desire and need for friends with whom we can survive the ups and downs of daily life. This set me off wondering what makes us so dependent upon friendship, why we desire it so much, why we don't need it to survive but won't survive without it. The answer, of course, is that we're made for friendship, hardwired into our DNA, because we are made for friendship with our Creator, God. As I've said many times before, God doesn't just want us to know about Him, He wants us to know Him. The Gospels tell us to trust Jesus as our Saviour, submit to Him as our King, and to know Him as our friend. John 15, 13 to 15 says this: "Greater love has no one than this, to lay down one's life for one's friends. You are my friends if you do what I command. I no longer call you servants, because a servant does not know his master's business. Instead, I have called you friends, for everything that I learned from the Father I have made known to you." What astonishing words from Jesus. You are my friends. It's privilege enough to be called Jesus' servant, but to be called a friend? But how do we know we're friends of Jesus? Because the cross proves the friendship of Jesus. What does it say in verse 13? Greater love has no one than this, to lay down one's life for one's friends. That is true, wonderfully true. And at this point in John's Gospel, Jesus was on his way to his own execution here to prove the point. Jesus laid down his life for us. He wanted the disciples to see it then, and through the Holy Spirit he wants us to see it now. He substituted himself for us, and he did it because he sees us as treasured friends. See, David and Jonathan's friendship is a clear parallel to Jesus' friendship with us. David points forward to Jesus, and Jonathan points forward to all of us followers of Jesus. Jonathan was Saul's heir to the throne and a friend of David. But David was Israel's anointed king. Jonathan had two choices. He either went against David, the anointed king, and set himself up as king, or he accepted David as king and denied himself. Jonathan responds by saying this in 1 Samuel 20, verse 4. "Whatever you want me to do, I will do it for you." See, we have the same choice. We can either set ourselves up as king of our own lives, or we can acknowledge Jesus as king and follow him. See, we must respond like Jonathan and say, "Jesus, whatever you want me to do, I will do it for you because you laid down your life for me out of your great love for me." In the end, Friends came to an end. The guys filmed the final episode, still working on the premise that all you need are a group of friends to get you through. I'm not so sure. I've still got my closest friends, but for me, I will take Jesus as my absolute friend. His friendship doesn't have a final episode, it's eternal. It's the only friendship which won't let you down. He's true to you, he encourages you, and most of all, he showed the greatest love possible when he died for me and you on a cross. If you don't know Jesus as your friend, then please get in touch or find a church and ask more. If you've let the friendship lapse, as we all do at times with our friends, then Jesus is waiting. He just wants you to talk to him again, and he'll be right back there with you. He doesn't hold a grudge. There's just rejoicing that you're back. Look to Jesus, because that is how to have the truest of friends.